Marriages don't always end with a single explosive fight. Sometimes they end in a very quiet moment when you see the person you love living a life you never knew existed. That's what happened to me in Chicago, though I didn't understand it yet. The morning my daughter suggested we go. When my husband left for a business trip to Chicago, our daughter said, "Let's go surprise Dad." So we booked a flight. But when we arrived at that hotel and the front desk clerk looked up from her screen with a confused frown, something in my chest went cold before I even had words for why. My name is Lily Cooper. I'm 43 years old, and until that weekend, I believed I understood my own life fairly well. I live in a quiet suburb outside Richmond, Virginia, in a brick colonial with a maple tree that turns the whole front yard orange every October. I work as the office manager and bookkeeper at a dental practice, a job I've held for 11 years. One that suits my particular love of order columns that balance appointments that don't overlap, small problems that have clean solutions. My husband Mason is 48. He's a regional sales director for a medical device company, the kind of job that requires a good suit, a firm handshake, and enough charm to make a hospital administrator feel like the most important person in the room. We've been married 18 years. I won't pretend our marriage still burned the way it did when we were 25. Most marriages that last don't. The romance settles into something quieter, shared grocery lists, a hand on my back while we watch the evening news, the particular comfort of knowing exactly how someone takes their coffee. I had always believed that kind of steadiness was worth more than fireworks. I still believe that, actually. I just didn't understand back then that Mason and I had stopped agreeing on what steadiness meant. Over the past 6 months, his travel had increased. Client meetings, regional conferences, FaceTime with hospital procurement teams, reasonable explanations, all of them delivered in his easy, confident way. This particular trip to Chicago, he told me, mattered more than most. A major contract was riding on it. He gave me the hotel name without my asking, mentioned the conference schedule casually over dinner, the kind of detail a man volunteers when he has nothing to hide. When I suggested a video call one evening, he waved it off. The meeting room was crowded. The days were long. He'd rather just talk on the phone when he could. I didn't think twice about it. Why would I? Chloe, our 13-year-old, missed him more than she let on. She's quick and affectionate and fiercely attached to her father in that particular way. Only daughters seem to be. And lately, the house had felt a little emptier with him gone so often. One Saturday morning over pancakes, she looked up from her plate with an expression I recognized instantly. The one she gets when she's already decided something, and is just working up the courage to say it out loud. "Mama," she said, "what if we went to Chicago and surprised Dad?" I laughed at first, but she wasn't laughing, and the longer I looked at her waffle syrup on her chin, eyes bright with the idea, the more I felt something soften in me. Guilt, maybe. We hadn't done much together as a family lately, the three of us. I told myself this trip could fix, that could remind all of us what we were to each other. I requested Friday off work. I booked 2 tickets and a room at the very hotel Mason had named. Chloe spent an hour that evening making a card, her tongue between her teeth in concentration, and when she showed it to me, it read, "We missed you too much to stay home." I called Mason that night to tell him Chloe and I would be busy over the weekend. A small lie meant to keep him from calling while we were in the air. He didn't ask questions. If anything, he sounded relieved in a way I didn't examine, and enough. "Good," he said. "Maybe you two should have a girls' weekend." I remember that sentence exactly, because later I would replay it 100 times, turning it over like a stone looking for the crack I should have seen. That night Chloe couldn't sleep from excitement. She came into our room in her pajamas, hair in a loose braid, and climbed onto the edge of my bed the way she used to when she was small. "Do you think Dad will cry when he sees us?" she asked. "Maybe," I said, smoothing a piece of hair from her forehead, but in a good way. She smiled and went back to bed, and I lay awake a long while after imagining the look on Mason's face when he opened that hotel door, surprise, then joy, then that particular warmth he always had for our daughter. I spent the whole night picturing his happiness. I didn't know that when Mason actually saw us standing in Chicago, what would cross his face wouldn't be joy at all. It would be fear. We were up before the sun, the alarm cutting through the dark at 4:30 in the morning. The house still cold with that particular hush that only exists before dawn. Chloe was already awake when I knocked on her door, pulling on the gray hoodie Mason had given her for Christmas, the one with the little embroidered fox on the sleeve. She'd chosen it on purpose. I think some instinct telling her it would mean something to him to see her wearing it. The drive to the airport was quiet rain tapping lightly against the windshield. The highway nearly empty except for the occasional pair of headlights drifting past in the opposite direction. Chloe sat curled against the window with the card in her lap, checking every few minutes to make sure the corners hadn't bent in her backpack. "Do you think it'll get crushed?" she asked, and I told her I'd wrap it in a plastic sleeve at the gate if she wanted, which seemed to satisfy her. Security took longer than expected. We stood in a snaking line under fluorescent light, Chloe worrying aloud about whether her snow boots counted as bulky footwear. And by the time we made it through, we had just enough time to grab coffee and a waffle from a kiosk near our gate. She talked through the whole plan while we ate, how she wanted to knock on the door herself, how I should stand off to the side so Mason wouldn't see me first, how the two of us would count to 3 and yell, "Surprise!" Together, I watched her animated hands moving through the air as she described it, and I remember thinking clearly and simply that this had been the right decision, that whatever had felt slightly hollow in our house these past months, this weekend would begin to fill it back in. I texted Mason before boarding, "Hope your presentation goes well. We love you." His reply came almost instantly. "Going into meetings. Phone may be off all day." Something about that snagged briefly in my mind. He'd told me the night before that his presentation was scheduled for yesterday afternoon, not today, but I let it go. Conference schedules shift. I've worked in enough offices to know how often the plan changes by the hour. As we taxied toward the runway, another message came through. "Don't wait up tonight. Client dinner." I remember feeling just faintly that he was clearing the day in advance, making sure I wouldn't call and find him unavailable. I told myself I was being paranoid. I put my phone on airplane mode and watched Chloe pull down on the window shade so she wouldn't see how nervous she was about takeoff. Chicago greeted us with a hard, bright, cold wind coming straight off the lake and cutting through my coat like it wasn't there. Chloe pressed her face to the train window as the skyline rose up out of the flat gray horizon, all glass and steel. And for a moment, I let myself feel it too, the excitement of arriving somewhere new, somewhere our family didn't usually go. We took the train into the loop, then a short walk to the Hotel Mason had named an elegant business tower near the river, with a revolving door and a lobby that smelled like cedar and fresh flowers. We checked into our own room first. Chloe wanted to go straight up to her father's floor, tugging at my sleeve, practically vibrating with anticipation. I sat in, but I told her we needed to confirm his room number at the front desk before we went barging down some hallway. I approached the counter and explained, smiling, that we were hoping to surprise my husband, Mason Cooper, here for the medical sales conference. The young woman at the desk typed for a moment, frowned slightly, and typed again. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not showing a guest under that name." I told her the reservation was likely under the company name instead, and she checked again more carefully this time, scrolling through what must have been a conference block list. Then she looked up at me, with an expression that was trying gently to be helpful. "Me. The medical sales conference checked out yesterday afternoon." I stood there for a second without saying anything. Mason had told me. The conference ran through Sunday. I remember the strange sensation of the words simply not fitting into what I already knew, like trying to force a puzzle piece into the wrong slot. I told myself there had to be an explanation, an extension, a separate event, something. Chloe was a few feet away in the seating area, still hugging her card to her chest, oblivious, watching the door for her father the way you'd watch for a parade. I called Mason. It went straight to voicemail. I stood at that counter, turning the phone over in my hand, trying to construct some version of events that made sense when Chloe suddenly stood up and pointed through the tall windows facing the street. "Mom, isn't that Dad?" I turned. Across the street through the gray afternoon light, a man in a familiar brown coat was walking toward the glass doors of a service apartment building. The kind of place executives rent by the month, all clean lines and discreet awnings. I would have known that walk anywhere. 18 years of watching a man cross a room teaches you the shape of him even from a distance, even through glass, even in a city that wasn't ours. But he wasn't walking in alone. A woman had her arm looped through his, laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted toward his shoulder in a way that made my stomach drop before my mind had even caught up to what I was seeing. I moved fast, stepping between Chloe and the window before she could look any longer, murmuring something about how the light was playing tricks, how it probably wasn't him. But I knew. I knew from the coat, the brown wool one I'd bought him 2 winters ago, at the outlet mall in Short Pump, complaining the whole drive home about the price. I knew from the way he carried his shoulders slightly forward, like he was always walking into a meeting he needed to win. I knew from the leather bag swinging at his side, the one I'd given him for his 45th birthday, with his initials stitched into the strap. Chloe wanted to run across the street right then, tugging at my hand, asking why we weren't going to say hello. I told her we should get settled first, drop our bags, let Dad finish whatever he was doing. I needed a few minutes, just a few, to understand what I'd seen before I let it anywhere near my daughter. Back in our room, I called Mason again. This time he answered with a text instead of a call. Still in meetings. Can't talk. I stared at those words, knowing they'd arrived only minutes after I'd watched him disappear through a set of glass doors with a woman on his arm. There was no more room left for doubt, no gentler interpretation I could bend the facts into. I asked Chloe to stay in the room and watch something on TV while I went down to sort out a mix-up with Dad's reservation. She agreed, a little disappointed, already reaching for the remote, and I stepped out into the hallway, feeling like I was walking through water. I crossed the street and sat in the corner of the apartment building's small cafe, ordering a coffee. I had no intention of drinking, watching the elevator bank and the front doors. 20 minutes passed. Then the doors opened, and Mason walked out with the same woman, both of them dressed for dinner now. Her in a fitted black dress, him in the navy jacket I'd steamed for him myself before he left. This wasn't 2 colleagues finishing a meeting. This was something else entirely. Something with rhythm and habit built into it, the kind of ease that only comes from repetition. He rested his hand at the small of her back as they walked toward the door. She turned and kissed his cheek light and familiar and said something I wasn't meant to hear but did anyway, her voice carrying just enough in the quiet lobby. Once the divorce is final, we won't have to keep doing this. I stood up. My legs moved before my mind had fully processed the sentence. I said his name just that flat and clear. Mason. He turned, and I watched his face do something I will never forget. The easy, practiced calm sliding off in an instant, replaced by something closer to raw panic. The woman looked between us, confused, her smile fading into uncertainty. "What are you doing in Chicago?" Mason asked, as if I were the one who owed an explanation. "Our daughter wanted to surprise her father," I said. His face went the color of the sidewalk. The woman looked at me properly now, taking in my coat, my face, searching for context. "Your daughter?" she asked. "I'm Lily Cooper," I said, Mason's wife. I watched the words land on her like something physical. Her arm slid slowly away from his. She introduced herself. "Claire," she said, though I barely registered it at the time, and I could see plainly that she was as blindsided as I was, just from a different direction. Over the next few minutes in halting, disbelieving fragments, the shape of what Mason had built came into focus. Claire believed he and I had been separated for nearly a year. She believed we lived in different houses. She believed the divorce papers were filed and simply awaiting a judge's signature. Mason had even shown her a photograph of the documents. She said the pages spread across a kitchen table she'd assumed was his own. I had never seen those papers. I had certainly never signed anything. Claire's expression shifted from confusion to something colder as the truth settled over her, too. She hadn't just been lied to about a marriage's status. She'd been made complicit in a fiction unknowingly for months. Mason tried to speak something about a complicated misunderstanding, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. How long have you been telling people our marriage was over? I asked him. He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. Or if he did, he wasn't brave enough to say it out loud in that lobby in front of two women who had, each in their own way, trusted him with a version of the truth he'd invented for his own convenience. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A message from Chloe, 13 years old and still holding a homemade card, waiting patiently, 4 floors above a life she had no idea existed. Mom, when can we surprise Dad? I looked at Mason standing there, guilt written plainly across a face I'd known for 2 decades, and understood with sudden and terrible clarity that the hardest part of this day wasn't what I'd just witnessed. It was walking back across that street and figuring out what to say to the little girl who still believed her father was going to cry happy tears when he saw her. Before I went back to Chloe, I turned to Mason once more. I told him quietly, and without drama, that she hadn't seen anything, not the woman, not the apartment building, none of it, and that he was not to come to our room until I decided how or whether to tell her something had gone wrong. He tried to follow me anyway, already talking, already reaching for some explanation he thought might soften what I'd seen. I stopped him at the hotel's revolving door. You had months to explain, I said. You chose to lie instead. He didn't follow me further. Upstairs, Chloe was sitting cross-legged on the bed, the card resting in her lap, half watching a cartoon with the sound low. She looked up when I came in, and I watched her face change the moment she really looked at mine. The way children do. Reading you before you've said a single word. She asked why we weren't going to see Dad's hotel room. I told her his plans had shifted because of work, that he was staying somewhere else nearby. It wasn't a full lie. It also wasn't the truth, and I hated in that moment being the kind of mother who had to choose which one to give her. Did Dad do something bad? She asked, and there was no getting around the directness of that question. The way children cut straight to what adults spend hours dancing around. Your father made choices that hurt our family, I said. I'm still trying to understand them myself. About an hour later, there was a knock. Chloe ran for the door before I could stop her. But she slowed when she saw both our faces, mine carefully composed, Mason's raw and uncertain in a way I'd rarely seen. She still handed him the card. He unfolded it slowly, read the words she'd written in careful looping handwriting. We missed you too much to stay home. And I watched something in him break open. He wasn't performing. For the first time all day, I believed what I saw on his face was real, the beginning of understanding what his choices had actually cost. Chloe asked why he'd told us he was in meetings when he wasn't at the conference at all. Mason fumbled for an answer that never quite arrived. She looked at him with the plain, unblinking honesty only a 13-year-old can manage. You told me lying was what people did when they were afraid of the truth, she said. He had nothing to say to that. Neither did I. Later that evening, after Mason left and Chloe had finally fallen asleep with the television still murmuring, my phone lit up with a message from an unfamiliar number. It was Claire. She'd found my information somewhere, social media maybe, or an old business card Mason had left in a drawer, and she said, to tell me everything. I almost didn't respond, but something told me I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with, so I let her talk. Over the next hour, in a long, unraveling series of messages, Claire laid out 9 months of a relationship built on a story Mason's had constructed with real care. He'd told her we separated almost a year earlier. He said he'd been staying at the Chicago apartment on business trips ever since, slowly building a life there ahead of an eventual permanent move once the divorce was finalized. She sent screenshots, conversations where he wrote plainly, Lily already signed. I'm just waiting for the court date. In another, he explained he'd used money from his portion of the assets to cover the deposit on the apartment they'd been living in together, part-time for months. I sat on the edge of the bathroom sink after reading that the door shut so Chloe wouldn't wake, and opened our banking app with hands that weren't quite steady. Our joint savings account looked ordinary enough, but the investment account, the one Mason had always managed, the one I'd trusted him with because numbers weren't my interest and seemed to enjoy them, had been steadily bleeding for 6 months. Through small transfers, Easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. $4. 800 in February, 7,200 in April, 9,500 more in June. Because he handled the investments, I'd simply never checked. Altogether, nearly $78,000 had quietly disappeared. I sat there a long time with the phone glowing in my hands, doing the kind of math that has nothing to do with numbers, counting up not dollars but months, meetings missed, video calls, all the small excuses I had accepted without question, because I trusted the man giving them to me. When Mason finally texted asking if we could talk in the morning, I didn't answer right away. I looked instead at Chloe, asleep with one arm flung over the blanket, still wearing the fox hoodie she'd chosen that morning to make her father smile. I thought of the question I would eventually ask him, the one that had already begun forming in the quiet of that bathroom. Was Claire the only thing you were hiding? Somehow, I already knew the answer wasn't going to be simple. Chicago hadn't just exposed an affair. It had cracked open a door, and behind it was something far larger. A life Mason had been building for months, brick by brick, while I stood in our kitchen back in Richmond, believing every word he told me. We changed our flights and flew home the next morning. Mason stayed behind, telling us he needed to sort things out with work. Though I understood by then, he simply didn't have the nerve to sit beside us on that plane. The flight home was nothing like the flight there. Chloe didn't talk. The card sat folded at the bottom of her backpack, and she spent most of the trip looking out the window at the clouds, occasionally asking questions I didn't fully know how to answer, whether her father was going to leave us, whether this was somehow her fault for suggesting the trip in the first place. I told her as steadily as I could manage that whatever happened between her father and me, she would never be abandoned. I meant it. I still do. Once we were home, I didn't cry in front of her, and I didn't fall apart the way some part of me wanted to. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I got organized. I backed up every bank statement I could find. I photographed our tax returns, our mortgage documents, the deed to the house. I changed the passwords on my personal accounts and kept copies of our birth certificates, passports, and insurance records somewhere Mason wouldn't think to look. I didn't drain any joint accounts. I didn't destroy a single thing that belonged to him. I didn't post a word of it online. Some instinct in me understood, even in the rawest hours of that week, that how I handled this would matter. Not just for the divorce, but for the woman I would still have to look at in the mirror afterward. I found a divorce attorney named Rachel Moreno through a coworker who'd gone through her own difficult separation 2 years earlier. Rachel was calm, in a way that felt almost clinical, which I needed badly at the time. She told me not to confront Mason further until we'd secured our financial footing. Money moved during a marriage, she explained, generally still counted as shared property, regardless of whose name was on the account. She recommended a forensic accountant. She told me that if Mason had used our joint funds to support a relationship outside our marriage, that spending could be factored back into how our assets were eventually divided. She also cautioned me gently, but firmly, not to block Mason from seeing Chloe unless there was a genuine safety concern. Punishing him through our daughter would only end up costing Chloe more than it cost him. I told Rachel in a moment of raw honesty that some part of me wanted him to lose everything. She looked at me evenly and said something I've carried with me since. Your goal isn't to destroy him. Your goal is to keep him from destroying what remains. The forensic accountant confirmed what I already suspected and then some. Nearly $78,000 had moved out of our investment account into personal accounts Mason controlled alone. Some of it covered rent on the Chicago apartment. Some went toward jewelry, weekend trips, a deposit that would have secured that same apartment as a permanent residence. Worse, several of those trips had been submitted to his company as legitimate business travel and reimbursed. And tucked away in our shared cloud storage, a folder I'd forgotten even existed, one we'd used years earlier for wedding photos, was a draft separation agreement Mason had apparently been quietly assembling. In it, he proposed I keep the house, but take on the full mortgage myself. He intended to keep the bulk of his retirement account. He planned to relocate to Chicago, Chloe in his draft would see him during select holidays, as though her presence in his life were a line item to be scheduled, rather than a relationship to be protected. Mason came home 3 days later, likely expecting tears or shouting or some version of me begging him to stay. Instead, I had the financial documents laid out on the kitchen table when he walked in. He glanced at them and immediately claimed the money had been a personal bonus, something separate from our shared finances. I reminded him calmly that the funds had gone into our joint account first before he'd quietly redirected them. He accused me of violating his privacy by looking too closely. Privacy is closing the bathroom door, I told him. This was deception. He didn't have a response for that either. A few days later, Rachel formally notified Mason that I had filed for divorce and was requesting a temporary order to protect our remaining shared assets. Mouthy, he read the letter standing in our kitchen. The same kitchen where we'd eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners over 18 years, and looked at me with an expression somewhere between disbelief and grief. "You're really going to end 18 years over one mistake?" he asked. I thought about Chicago, the hotel lobby, the apartment building. The Claire's arm looped through his, the draft agreement hidden in a folder meant for wedding memories. I thought about every small excuse I had accepted without question, because I trusted the man giving them to me. "Chicago wasn't one mistake," I said. "It was where I finally saw all the choices you had already made." I watched something in his face give way. Not quite acceptance, not yet, but the first crack in the story he'd been telling himself. Outside the porch, light flickered on with the dusk timer, the same one Mason had installed years ago. Back when installing things for our house still felt like an act of love rather than a habit left over from one. Mason moved into a rented apartment across town, one of those beige complexes with a pool no one used in winter. For the first few weeks, Chloe refused to see him. I never pushed her toward forgiveness, but I did encourage her to talk to someone. A family therapist Rachel recommended, a woman named Dr. Patel, who specialized in adolescents navigating divorce. Mason texted Chloe every day. She read the messages. She didn't answer most of them. I had my own life to keep upright in the meantime. There were bills that didn't care about heartbreak, a job that still needed me at 8 sharp every morning, a daughter whose school schedule didn't pause for any of this. Neighbors asked carefully where Mason had been. Lately, I kept my answers short and unremarkable. I wasn't interested in turning our street into an audience. Claire, for her part, sent everything she had to Rachel: months of text messages, apartment receipts, photographs, even the doctored image of divorce papers Mason had shown her to prove our marriage was already over. She cut off all contact with him completely. When she reached out to apologize to me directly, I didn't feel much anger left for her by that point. "You believed the same man I did," I told her. "The difference is I believed him for 18 years. Mason's company eventually noticed the pattern in his expense reports. Personal trips to Chicago quietly logged as client visits, hotel charges that didn't match any calendar entry for actual client meetings. There was no dramatic arrest, no handcuffs, nothing from a television drama. He was suspended pending an internal review, required to repay the misused funds, and stripped of his management title. Rather than wait for the investigation to conclude publicly, he resigned. He blamed me at first for destroying his career, as though I'd been the one filing his expense reports for him. I reminded him without raising my voice that I hadn't contacted his company at all. His own paperwork had done that on its own. The divorce settlement negotiations stretched over several difficult months. Mason initially wanted to keep the bulk of his retirement account and have me sell the house outright. But the forensic accounting told a different story than the one he wanted told. Nearly $78,000 diverted toward a life outside our marriage money. The court would ultimately treat as part of his share of our combined assets, rather than an untouched bonus. In the final agreement, I kept the house provided I could refinance the mortgage in my name alone. The retirement accounts were split according to state guidelines. Mason agreed to contribute to Chloe's therapy and future school expenses. Custody was arranged with an emphasis on stability for her, not convenience for either of us. There was no thunderous moment in a courtroom. No judge slamming a gavel. No scene worthy of daytime television. The real weight of everything settled instead in a quiet conversation Mason and I had after the mediation session ended. Standing near the elevators of an unremarkable office building, both of us worn thin from months of paperwork and lawyers and careful guarded phone calls. "I never meant to lose my family," he said. "You didn't lose us in Chicago," I told him. "You spent 9 months building a life that didn't include us." He asked quietly if I thought I'd ever forgive him. I considered the question honestly before answering, because I owed him at least that much honesty even now. "Forgiveness may come later," I said. "Trust is not coming back." He nodded slowly like he'd expected that answer, and hated hearing it confirmed anyway. There was nothing left to say after that. We rode the elevator down together in silence. Two people who had once built an entire life out of small ordinary days, now dividing that life into folders and signatures. Outside, Chloe was waiting in the car exactly where I'd asked her to sit while the meeting finished. She rolled down the window as I approached, her expression somewhere between hopeful and braced for bad news, the way 13-year-olds often look when they're trying very hard to seem older than they are. "Is it over?" she asked. I got in beside her, started the engine, and let the heater begin to hum against the late autumn chill outside. "The marriage is ending," I said. "Our life isn't." She studied me for a moment, the way she'd studied my face back in that Chicago hotel room, searching for the truth underneath my words. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her at least enough for now. She reached over and turned up the radio, and we drove home together through streets that looked exactly the same as they had a year earlier, even though nearly everything about our lives inside them had changed. 9 months passed the way difficult years sometimes do, slowly in the moment, and then looking back all at once. The divorce was finalized in early spring. I refinanced the mortgage on my own, nervous the whole process, but I kept the house, which meant Chloe didn't have to change schools or say goodbye to the maple tree she'd been climbing since she was 6. I picked up freelance bookkeeping work in the evenings, a few small local businesses. At first a flower shop, a family-owned hardware store, word spreading slowly the way it does when people trust you with their numbers. Eventually I turned it into something more official, a small practice of my own. It wasn't the kind of transformation you'd see in a movie, no dramatic reveal of hidden success, just steady, reasonable independence built one client at a time. Chloe and Mason found their way back to each other slowly through short lunches at first, an hour here and there, nothing forced. Their relationship wasn't what it had been before Chicago, and I don't think it ever fully will be. He wasn't handed forgiveness the moment he asked for it. To his credit, he didn't expect it to work that way. He started therapy of his own, and for the first time since I'd known him, he began owning his choices out loud instead of explaining them away. I stayed out of it, mostly stepping in only when I needed to remind him that Chloe's boundaries came first, not his comfort. One evening, months into this new rhythm, Chloe sat on the porch steps beside me while the sky turned that particular shade of orange it gets in late summer. "I still love Dad," she said, watching a pair of fireflies blink somewhere near the hedge. "I just don't trust him yet." "You're allowed to feel both," I told her, and I meant it more than I think she realized. A few weeks after that conversation, I was cleaning out a hallway closet and found the card, the one she'd made for that Chicago trip, still folded the way it had been in her backpack, the crease from the flight permanently pressed into the paper. I brought it to her and asked if she wanted to keep it somewhere. She looked at it for a long moment, turning it over once in her hands. "No," she said finally. "That was for the dad I thought I was going to see." She didn't tear it up or throw it away in some symbolic act of anger. She placed it carefully in a small keepsake box in her room, tucked between old birthday cards and a ticket stub from a school play. It felt right somehow, not erasing what had happened, just no longer letting it steer the direction of her days. Almost a year after that first trip, Chloe and I flew back to Chicago together, just the two of us this time. We walked along the river, with the wind coming off the water the same way it had before, except this time it didn't feel like something I needed to brace against. We ate deep dish pizza at a place near the Loop, wandered through a museum for most of an afternoon, and took photos in front of the lake, with the skyline stretched out gray and silver behind us. At one point, standing at the railing with the water moving slow beneath us, Chloe asked if I regretted coming here that first time, if some part of me wished we'd never booked those tickets at all. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I regret what we found, I said, but I don't regret finding the truth. She nodded slowly the way she does when she's turning an idea over in her mind, testing its weight before deciding what to do with it. For a long time after that first trip, I believed it had been the thing that broke our family apart. I understand now that isn't quite right. Chicago didn't create the lie Mason had been living. It simply made it impossible for that lie to stay hidden any longer. The truth hurt more than almost anything I've known, but it also gave me back something I hadn't realized I'd lost along the way. The right to decide clearly and honestly what the rest of my life was going to look like. Our family doesn't resemble what it used to be, but it's still a family just built differently now, on steadier ground than the one I didn't know I'd been standing on before. Healing, I've learned, isn't about forgetting. It's about reaching a place where the memory no longer decides what tomorrow gets to be. We flew to Chicago because my daughter wanted to surprise her father. Instead, we discovered the life he had been hiding from us. For a long time, I thought that trip ended my family. Now I understand it ended the lie. And sometimes, the end of a lie is where your real life finally begins. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear where it found you tonight. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Did Lily make the right choices, or would you have done something differently? We share stories like this every week, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. Thank you for spending this time with me. Let's keep walking through these stories together. I was standing in my own kitchen unwrapping a stack of wedding china when a stranger's voice on the phone told me something no wife should ever have to hear about her husband. I saw them together, he said. Your husband and his mother. Don't tell him. Come alone. I stood there with a teacup in my hand, staring at the two people I trusted most in the world laughing softly in my living room. And I understood in that instant that the life I thought I was building might already be gone. My name is Catherine Baker, and 7 days earlier, my husband Jonathan and I had closed on the house of our dreams, a 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a garden bed I'd already mapped out in my head for tomatoes and hydrangeas. I had put down most of the money myself, an inheritance from my father, a man who spent 30 years teaching high school chemistry and never once complained about the modest life it gave him. He left me enough to make this house possible. And when I signed the closing papers, I remember thinking that he would have been proud. I remember thinking that finally at 40 years old I had built something permanent. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while boxes still lined the hallway, and the smell of fresh paint hung in the air. I didn't recognize the number, so I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. Mrs. Baker. This is Thomas Reed. I sold you the house. I remembered him instantly. A soft-spoken man in his 70s, a retired electrical engineer with kind eyes, and a slight tremor in his hands when he shook mine at the closing table. He'd lived in that house for 31 years with his late wife, and when he handed over the keys, he told me he hoped it would treat me as well as it had treated them. Mr. Reed, is everything all right? There was a pause long enough that I thought the call had dropped. I need to apologize for something, he finally said. When we set up the smart home system years ago, we installed a security camera in the living room. I disconnected most of them before the sale, but I missed one. It's still linked to my cloud account. I only noted it because I got a notification a few days ago, and I went to delete the footage, and he stopped again. Do Mrs. Baker, I think you need to see this yourself. My stomach tightened, though I couldn't have told you why. See what? I'd rather not say over the phone. I saved everything to a drive. Please come see me. Alone. Don't say anything to your husband yet. His voice dropped lower. Careful, almost protective. Please, come alone. I told him I would, and I hung up before I could ask anything else, because my hands had started to shake, and I didn't want him to hear it in my voice. I set the phone down on the counter and looked through the doorway into the living room, where Jonathan was standing on a step stool, hanging a framed photograph of his parents' wedding day. Drew and his mother, Diane, was directing him with the calm authority of a woman who had never once doubted her own judgment. "A little to the left," she said, and Jonathan adjusted it without complaint, the way he always did with her. They were laughing about something, some small joke I hadn't caught, and for a moment, I just watched them, searching their faces for some crack, some sign of whatever Thomas Reed thought I needed to see. There was nothing. Jonathan turned and caught my eye, and smiled at me that same easy smile that had made me fall for him 12 years ago, back when I was still grieving my father. And he showed up at exactly the right moments. With exactly the right, he asked. "You look pale." "Fine," I said. "Just tired. I think I'm going to run out for a bit. I forgot we're low on paint for the guest room." It was a lie, smooth and immediate, and it frightened me a little how easily it came. Diane glanced at me, her eyes lingering half a second too long, the way they sometimes did, as if she were always quietly measuring me against some standard I would never meet. "Take your time, dear," she said. "We'll finish up here." I grabbed my keys and my purse and walked out to the car with my heart hammering against my ribs, and I sat behind the wheel for a full minute before I could make myself turn the key. I told myself it was nothing, a misunderstanding. Maybe Thomas Reed had simply seen Jonathan and Diane moving furniture or measuring for curtains, or doing any of the 100 mundane things people do when they're settling into a new home. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation, because that was easier than the alternative, but some part of me already knew. Some part of me had known for a while, in the way you know a storm is coming before the sky actually turns the small hesitations. Before Jonathan answered certain questions the way Diane had insisted on being there for. The final walkthrough, the way both of them had grown a little too comfortable, a little too fast in a house that had my father's money holding up its foundation. I pulled out of the driveway and looked once in the rearview mirror at the house. My house, I reminded myself, glowing gold in the late afternoon light, looking exactly like the future I had planned for myself. I didn't know yet that I was driving toward the moment that would end my marriage. I only knew that whatever waited for me at Thomas Reed's front door, I needed to see it with my own eyes. Thomas Reed's new place was a small rental on the other side of town, the kind of tidy, quiet house that belongs to a man who has spent his whole life being careful. He opened the door before I even knocked, as though he'd been watching for my car, and the look on his face told me this wasn't going to be the misunderstanding I'd hoped for on the drive over. "Thank you for coming," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "I wasn't sure you would. You made it sound important." "It is." He led me to a small kitchen table where a laptop was already open, the screen dark, waiting. "Please sit." I sat, and I noticed my hands were cold despite the warm afternoon, and I folded them together in my lap because I didn't want him to see them trembling. Thomas lowered himself into the chair across from me with the careful movements of a man whose knees had given him trouble for years, and he was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "I want you to understand something first," he said. "I'm not a man who goes looking for other people's business. I built that camera system myself years ago, mostly for my wife's peace of mind when I traveled for work. When we sold the house, I disconnected every camera I could remember. I missed one, the one behind the bookshelf in the living room, wired into an outlet I forgot even existed. I only found out it was still active because my cloud storage sent a notification that it was full." He paused. "I went to delete the footage, and then I watched it, and I couldn't in good conscience delete it without showing you first." "Show me," I said, because I couldn't bear the waiting anymore. He turned the laptop toward me and pressed play. The footage was time-stamped from 4 days earlier, a Friday afternoon, when I'd been at the office finishing a project that had kept me late into the evening. The angle was slightly elevated, looking down over the living room. My living room, still half-furnished boxes stacked along one wall. I watched Jonathan let himself in through the front door, and a moment later, Diane followed him inside, glancing around the room the way a person looks at something they're already picturing as their own. I watched myself lean forward without meaning to, as though getting closer to the screen might somehow change what I was about to hear. "She still thinks this house belongs to both of you," Diane said on the recording, settling onto the arm of the sofa, her voice carrying that particular blend of warmth and steel I'd heard my entire marriage. "Sweet girl, she never even reads the fine print." Jonathan laughed an easy, familiar laugh, the same one I'd fallen in love with 12 years ago, and said, "She trusts me. Why would she read the fine print? I'm her husband." "That trust is useful," Diane said, "as long as we use it correctly." I felt something cold settle into my chest, a stillness that didn't yet have a name. They kept talking. Diane mentioned a refinance package. She'd already been in contact with a broker about someone she knew personally, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Jonathan mentioned that my father's inheritance had covered nearly 70% of the down payment, and Diane responded that it was a shame money like that hadn't gone through proper family channels, that it should have been structured better from the start. They spoke about paperwork, about a power of attorney clause buried somewhere in a stack of documents that would let ownership shift gradually, quietly, legally, without ever requiring a single dramatic confrontation. Diane said the words "over time" more than once, savoring them the way you might a recipe that needed patience to come together properly. "She won't notice," Jonathan said. "She never notices these things. She trusts me with all of it." I sat frozen at Thomas Reed's kitchen table, watching my husband describe my blind trust as a resource to be managed. And I understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that the man who had held my hand at my father's funeral and the man on that screen were somehow impossibly the same person. The video ran another 6 minutes. I watched all of it. I watched Diane walk through my kitchen, opening cabinets, commenting that the layout would be better suited to proper entertaining once a few walls came down. I watched Jonathan nod along to every suggestion, agreeable in the particular way he'd always been agreeable with his mother, a lifelong habit I had once found endearing because it spoke, I thought, of loyalty and love. I understood now that it spoke of something else. Obedience, maybe, or alliance. When the footage ended, Thomas closed the laptop gently, as though closing it too fast might hurt me further. "I copied everything onto a drive," he said, sliding a small USB stick across the table toward me. "Every angle, every date, everything the camera caught. I don't know what's going on in your marriage, Mrs. Baker, and it isn't my place to guess, but a house holds people accountable to nothing except what's documented. I thought you should have this before anyone decides to erase what actually happened inside those walls." I picked up the drive and held it in my palm, small and light, barely the weight of a house key, and yet it felt like it might tip the entire foundation of my life. "Thank you," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "I don't know how to repay this." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I sold that house because my wife and I made a home in it, and I'd hate to think of someone taking that same chance away from another family through a lie." He walked me to the door, and just before I stepped out into the fading light, he said one more thing quietly, almost like a warning. "You still have time, Mrs. Baker. Whatever you decide to do, you still have time to do it right." I drove home with the USB drive tucked into my coat pocket, my hand resting over it at every red light, as though it might disappear if I let go. And somewhere on that quiet drive back to the house I had paid for with my father's memory, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly how deep this went, and exactly how to make sure it could never happen to me, or to anyone else again. I walked back into my own house that evening and became someone else. Not a different woman, exactly. Just a quieter version of myself, one who had learned in the space of a single afternoon that the safest place to keep the truth was behind a closed door in my own chest. "How was the paint store?" Jonathan asked, not even looking up from the box of kitchen utensils he was unpacking. "Busy," I said. "I'll go back tomorrow when it's quieter." He nodded satisfied, and that was the end of it. I remember standing in the doorway for a moment, watching him arrange our forks and knives into the drawer organizer I'd bought weeks earlier with such simple happiness, and feeling something strange settle over me. Not rage, not yet, but a kind of cold clarity, like stepping outside on the first frost of the year and finally being able to see your own breath. Over the following days, I did something I had never done in 12 years of marriage. I started watching my husband, the way you watch a stranger. I noticed things I'd always seen but never truly looked at. Jonathan handled every piece of financial paperwork that came through our mailbox, sorting bills and statements with a practiced efficiency I'd once admired, calling it just easier this way whenever I offered to help. I noticed that Diane, who visited nearly every other day under the guise of helping us settle in, always managed to be the one who collected the mail from the box at the end of the driveway before I even got home from work. I noticed the way their conversation would shift the moment I entered a room, not stopping exactly, but softening, rerouting, like water finding a different path around a rock. None of it on its own would have meant anything. Together, it meant everything. 3 days after my visit to Thomas Reed's house, Jonathan came home with a folder of documents and laid them on the dining table with the easy, unbothered manner of a man discussing weekend plans. Refinance paperwork, he said. Nothing exciting, just cleaning up some of the loan terms now that we've closed. Routine stuff. Diane, who happened to be there, she seemed always to happen to be there, reached over and patted my hand. Everyone does this after closing, dear. It's boring, but it's just paperwork. You sign a few pages and it's done. I looked at the folder, thick and official, and felt the cold clarity from days earlier harden into something more useful. A plan. Of course, I said, smiling. Let me look it over when I have a quiet evening. I like to actually read things before I sign. You know how I am. Jonathan's jaw tightened for half a second, so briefly I might have imagined it if I hadn't been watching so closely. Of course, he said. No rush. But there was a rush. I could feel it in the air between them, in the way Diane's eyes flicked toward Jonathan and back to me, and the slight practiced patience of two people, trying not to seem eager. I asked innocent questions over the following evenings. What does this clause mean? Why is this section highlighted? Is this the standard form the bank uses? And each time Jonathan answered smoothly, confidently, clearly relieved that I wasn't pushing harder, he began to relax. He began, I think, to believe that his mother had been right about me all along, that I was too trusting, too soft, too in love to ever really look. What he didn't know was that every night after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a soft blue light going through every page of that folder line by line. I photographed each document with my phone before returning the folder exactly to where he'd left it. I opened a new email account under a name that meant nothing to anyone but me, and began forwarding copies there along with photos, screenshots, and dates. I kept a small voice recorder in my cardigan pocket during family dinners, capturing conversations I would later replay in my car during my lunch break, parked 3 blocks from my office, where no one I knew would see me crying quietly before wiping my face and going back to work like nothing had happened. I built a folder of my own, a shadow archive invisible to them, growing heavier every day, with proof of exactly what I'd witnessed on Thomas Reed's laptop. It was on the 5th night, reading by the small glow of my screen while Jonathan slept upstairs, that I found the clause that changed everything. Buried on page 14 of the refinance documents in language so dense and technical it seemed designed to be skipped over, was a provision granting Jonathan limited power of attorney over matters related to the property to be enacted upon my signature and notarized approval. It was worded carefully, almost elegantly, framed as a convenience, something to streamline future paperwork so I wouldn't be burdened by routine administrative matters. I read it 3 times to be certain I understood what I was looking at. It wasn't a refinance. Or rather, it was a refinance wrapped around something else entirely. A legal key that once turned would let Jonathan make decisions about my house, my father's money, my future without ever needing to ask me again. I sat very still in the dark kitchen, listening to the old house settle around me. Its unfamiliar creaks still strange to my ears after only a week of living there. I thought about my father, about the quiet, careful way he'd saved his money over 30 years, of teaching chemistry to teenagers who mostly didn't care, about how he used to tell me that the surest way to lose something valuable wasn't theft. It was trust handed to the wrong person without ever checking where it landed. I closed the laptop, and for the first time since that phone call, I allowed myself a small grim smile in the darkness. They thought I was signing away my future. I was about to make sure I never lost it at all. I found Michael Grant's name the way most people find lawyers when it's ready to ask anyone they know. A late-night search on my phone in bed with the screen brightness turned all the way down so the light wouldn't wake Jonathan beside me. Real estate attorney. 26 years of practice. Reviews that used words like discreet and thorough. I called his office the next morning from the parking lot of the grocery store. My heart pounding as though I were doing something shameful instead of something necessary, and I asked for the earliest appointment available that didn't require me to explain myself to a receptionist. Michael Grant's office was small and unglamorous, tucked above a dry cleaner's on a quiet street, and I liked him immediately for exactly that reason. Nothing about him seemed interested in impressing me. He was maybe 58 gray at the temples, with the unhurried manner of a man who had seen every version of the story I was about to tell him, and had stopped being surprised by any of them years ago. I brought everything: the USB drive, my photographs of the documents, copies of emails, the voice recordings which I'd organized by date on my phone. I set it all on his desk like evidence at a trial, because in some sense I suppose that's exactly what it was. He watched the footage, first in silence, his expression unreadable, occasionally pausing to write something on a legal pad, in handwriting too small for me to read upside down. When it ended, he sat back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "Mrs. U. Baker, I want to be direct with you because I think you'd prefer that to gentleness right now." "Please," I said. "This is not a routine refinance. The power of attorney clause on page 14, if signed and notarized, would give your husband broad authority over decisions related to the property. Not immediately total control, but enough scaffolding that, over time with a few more carefully worded documents, he could transfer ownership, take out loans against the equity, or sell the property all without requiring your active participation in each step. It's built to look harmless. It's built to be signed by someone who trusts the person handing it to them and doesn't read past the first paragraph." I felt my hands tighten in my lap. "So, it's legal?" "On its face, yes. That's what makes it dangerous. There's nothing illegal about a spouse asking another spouse to sign paperwork. The law generally assumes that if you signed something, you understood it, which means the only real protection you have is not signing it, and making very sure they can't quietly force the issue another way. Can they? Not if we move quickly." He tapped his pen against the pad. "I can file protective measures today. A notice of interest, updated deed language, and a formal record establishing you as the sole party, with authority to approve any transfer or encumbrance on the property. It won't stop them from asking you to sign anything, but it will mean that even if you did sign under pressure or without fully understanding, any transfer would require your personal verified appearance and separate legal counsel review before it could be finalized. In plain terms, I'm building a wall around the house that only you can open." Relief moved through me. So suddenly it was almost dizzying. But underneath it sat something harder, something that had been growing since the night I first read that clause by the glow of my laptop. "I want more than a wall, Mr. Grant. I want them to understand exactly what they tried to do. I want it documented. I want it undeniable." He studied me for a moment and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of quiet respect. "Then we do this carefully. You continue exactly as you have been. Don't refuse to sign, don't confront them. Let them believe they're close to finishing what they started. The more comfortable they become, the more they'll say, and the more they say, the stronger your position becomes. In the meantime, I file everything necessary to make sure that no matter what happens at that table, nothing actually transfers without going through me first." I left his office that afternoon with of my own, now carbon copies of every filing he'd promised to submit that week, and I drove home rehearsing quietly the version of myself I needed to keep performing. Grateful wife, trusting wife, a woman slowly, sweetly coming around to signing away a life she didn't yet know, was already legally armored against them. It worked better than I expected. Within 2 days, Jonathan's demeanor had shifted from cautious to comfortable. The tightness I'd noticed around his jaw during our first conversation about the paperwork now entirely gone. He began speaking more openly at dinner, mentioning offhand that maybe once things were settled, he'd finally get quotes for that home office he'd always wanted in the basement. Diane, sensing victory the way she seemed to sense everything, began arriving with paint swatches and furniture catalogs, holding them up against my walls with the proprietary confidence of a woman decorating a house she already considered hers. I watched them build their comfort like a house of cards, one relaxed conversation at a time, and I said nothing to disturb it. On a Thursday evening, Diane mentioned almost casually that she knew a notary who could come by the house directly. So much easier than driving somewhere, dear, especially with how busy you've been. I let a beat of hesitation pass, the kind a woman might show when finally letting go of something she'd been holding too tightly, and then I smiled. Monday, I said. Let's do Monday. I'll have the whole weekend to feel settled about it. Diane's face lit with something close to triumph. Jonathan reached over and squeezed my hand, and I let him, and I smiled back at him, with an ease that would have terrified me a week earlier, because I understood now, watching his relieved, satisfied face, that I was no longer the woman standing in the way of his plan. I was the woman closing the trap around it. The days between Thursday and Monday passed strangely stretched thin by a tension only I seemed to feel. In the house, everything looked like happiness. Jonathan hummed while he made coffee in the mornings. Diane arrived nearly every afternoon now, tape measure in hand, murmuring about where a sectional might go once we open up this space a little, as though the walls themselves already belonged to a future she'd already decided on. I let them talk. I let them plan. I poured coffee and nodded at fabric swatches and asked polite questions about square footage. And underneath all of it, I kept my phone recording in my cardigan pocket, kept my eyes open, kept building the case that Michael Grant would later call, with quiet professional understatement, one of the more thorough evidentiary files I've seen from a client who wasn't a lawyer herself. On Friday evening, Jonathan started talking about renovations with an openness he'd never shown before we married. He wanted to knock down the wall between the kitchen and the dining room. He wanted a home office in the basement, maybe a wet bar for entertaining his friends, the ones who still called him by the nickname he'd had at 22. He talked about all of it with the loose, easy confidence of a man discussing a house he no longer thought of as jointly owned, but simply his, with me as a pleasant, cooperative presence somewhere in the background of his plans. We could even look at getting a place upstate eventually, he said, refilling his wine glass. Once things are more flexible financially. Flexible how? I asked, keeping my voice light, curious, the voice of a woman who still believed she was simply along for the ride. Oh, once the paperwork's finalized, there's more room to make moves. Refinance again down the line. Maybe pull some equity for investments. Nothing to worry about. He smiled at me over his glass, and I smiled back, and I thought about Thomas Reed's camera behind the bookshelf, still capturing everything, still quietly telling the truth, even when no one in the room wanted it heard. Saturday brought Diane in full force, moving through my kitchen with a confidence that had stopped bothering to disguise itself as guest-like politeness. She opened the pantry and rearranged 2 shelves for better flow. She stood in the center of the living room, hands on her hips, and told Jonathan that the fireplace mantle would need to be replaced. Something with real character, not this builder-grade nonsense. The way you'd speak about a house you already owned outright, not one still legally standing in another woman's name. It was Sunday evening, the night before the scheduled signing, that gave me the piece of evidence I hadn't even known I was still missing. Jonathan found me in the kitchen washing the last of the dinner dishes, and he came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist in a gesture so familiar, so achingly ordinary, that for one unguarded moment, I nearly forgot everything I knew about him. He kissed the side of my head and murmured low and warm, thinking he was speaking only to me. thinking he was speaking to a woman who trusted him completely. "Once everything's transferred," he said, "you won't even have to think about any of this again. You'll just wake up one day and it'll all be handled. You won't even realize how it happened. That's the whole point. I want to protect you from having to deal with all this stress." I kept my hands moving in the soapy water, kept my breathing even, and somewhere in my cardigan pocket, the small recorder captured every word. "That sounds nice," I said. And I meant it to sound soft, grateful, the voice of a woman being cared for. Only I knew what those words actually were. A full, unguarded confession spoken by a man so certain of his victory that he no longer felt any need for caution. Monday morning, I met Michael Grant one final time before work in the parking lot of a coffee shop, 3 towns away from anywhere either of us was known. He confirmed that every filing was complete. The notice of interest recorded, the deed protections in place, the documentation package assembled and ready to be presented the moment it was needed. He looked at me with the same quiet respect he'd shown since our first meeting. "Are you ready for this evening?" he asked. "I've been ready," I said, "since the day I watched that video." That evening, I came home and found Jonathan setting the dining table with unusual care, the good plates, the candles we'd received as a wedding gift, and never once used a bottle of wine he'd clearly chosen for the occasion. Diane arrived shortly after, dressed as though for a small celebration, her smile wide and satisfied. "A little dinner before the signing," Jonathan said, pulling out my chair for me. "We thought you deserved something nice, given everything you've been so understanding about." I sat down at the table my father's money had helped build across from the 2 people who had spent weeks quietly planning to take it from me, and I smiled, and I picked up my glass when Jonathan raised his in a toast. "Nay it to new beginnings," he said, his eyes warm, his voice full of a happiness I once would have given anything to earn. "To new beginnings," I echoed, and I meant something entirely different by it than he did. Diane smiled at us both, radiant. Already decorating a house that would never truly be hers, and neither of them noticed the way I kept glancing toward the front door, waiting, counting the minutes, knowing that somewhere on the road toward our house, a car was already on its way carrying a man who would arrive before dinner, ended, and change everything they thought they had already won. Dinner unfolded exactly the way Jonathan had planned it. Candlelight flickering against the good china, wine poured a little too generously. Diane telling a long story about Jonathan's childhood that was meant, I think, to remind me of how deeply he belonged to this family, how naturally I should want to belong to it too. I laughed in the right places. I asked the right questions. I ate very little, because my stomach had been tight with anticipation since that morning, but no one seemed to notice, too absorbed in their own quiet celebration to look closely at me. When the plates were cleared, Jonathan reached into the sideboard drawer and pulled out the folder, setting it on the table between us with a gentleness that almost looked like reverence. He opened it to the final page, smoothing it flat with his palm, and slid a pen across the tablecloth toward me. "No rush," he said, though his eye said otherwise. "Whenever you're ready." Diane leaned forward slightly, her wine glass forgotten in her hand, watching the pen the way a person watches the last few seconds before a firework goes off. I picked it up. I let my fingers rest against it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, feeling the weight of everything the last 2 weeks had asked of me. The silence I'd had to keep, the smiles I'd had to fake, the nights I'd spent awake with a phone recorder in my pocket, and a heart full of grief for the marriage I'd thought I had. I lowered the pen toward the signature line. The doorbell rang. Jonathan's head snapped up, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "We're not expecting anyone," he said more to himself than to me, and he glanced at his mother, who shook her head slightly, equally confused. "I'll get it," I said, and I set the pen down without signing a single letter. I opened the door to find Michael Grant standing on the porch in a gray suit, calm and unhurried, a leather folder tucked under his arm. Behind him, a step back, stood a uniformed court officer, holding a small stack of documents. "Good evening, Mrs. Baker," Michael said, his voice pitched perfectly for the moment, professional, unbothered, utterly without drama, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd shouted. I believe this is a good time. I stepped aside and let them in. Jonathan rose from the table so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. What is this? His eyes moved from Michael to the officer to me, and I watched something behind them begin to shift. The first tremor of a man realizing the ground beneath him was no longer solid. Catherine, what's going on? I didn't answer right away. I walked back to my seat at the head of the table and sat down, keeping my hands in front of me the way I had learned to do in Michael's office. Calm, deliberate, a woman fully in possession of herself. Mr. and Mrs. Baker, Michael said, addressing Jonathan and Diane both. I'm here on behalf of my client Catherine Baker to formally notify you that the property at this address has been legally protected against unauthorized transfer, refinancing, or encumbrance. Any documents requiring her signature for such purposes are void as of today, and any future attempt to alter ownership status will require independent legal review and her verified unpressured consent. The court officer stepped forward and placed the documents on the table beside the folder. Jonathan had so carefully prepared in almost absurd symmetry, one stack representing the future they'd planned, the other quietly dismantling it. Diane's face had gone pale, her earlier warmth entirely drained away, replaced by something colder, sharper, the calculation she usually kept so carefully hidden now fully visible. This is absurd, she said. This is our family's home. Jonathan has every right. Jonathan has whatever rights are granted to him under the law, and under any agreement Catherine willingly and knowingly enters into, Michael said evenly. Neither applies here. Then he reached into his leather folder and set down one by one the evidence I had spent 2 weeks gathering in silence. Printed transcripts of the security footage from Thomas Reed's camera, screenshots of the refinance documents, page 14 circled in red, copies of emails between Diane and the mortgage broker she'd contacted without my knowledge, and finally, a small device, the voice recorder, which Michael pressed play on, filling the dining room with the sound of Jonathan's own voice from the night before, warm and unguarded, saying words he never imagined would be replayed in front of a court officer at his own dinner table. Once everything's transferred, you won't even have to think about any of this again. You won't even realize how it happened. Jonathan's face drained of color. Diane sat frozen, staring at the recorder as though it were something that had betrayed her personally. How long have you known? Jonathan asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier confidence, almost pleading. I looked at him, really looked the way I hadn't allowed myself to since that first phone call, searching one last time for some trace of the man I had married, the one who held my hand at my father's funeral, the one I had trusted with everything I had left in the world. Long enough, I said. The words hung in the room, simple and final, and I watched something in Jonathan's expression finally break. Not surprise, not even anger. Yet, just the slow, sinking understanding of a man who had spent weeks so certain of his own success that he never once considered the woman across the table might be watching him just as carefully as he'd been watching her. Diane opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, her eyes moving over the documents on the table, with the desperate calculation of someone searching for an exit that no longer existed. The candles were still burning. The wine was still half full in our glasses. And somewhere beneath the ruins of the celebration Jonathan had planned so carefully, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Not triumph, exactly, but a quiet, settling certainty that whatever came next, I would face it standing on ground that was finally and undeniably my own. For a long moment, no one at the table moved. The candles burned lower, wax pooling unevenly against the good china we'd never used before that night, and the silence stretched until Jonathan finally found his voice again, though it came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. Catherine, this isn't what it looks like. I never meant to take anything from you. I was trying to make things easier for both of us. You've always hated dealing with paperwork, with all the financial stuff. I was just trying to handle it so you wouldn't have to. You were trying to handle it, I repeated quietly, so completely that I would have needed your permission to make decisions about my own house. He had no answer for that. Diane, however, straightened in her chair, composing herself with the same brittle dignity, she'd worn at every family gathering I'd ever attended. "This is a misunderstanding born of overcaution," she said, addressing Michael Grant directly, as though she might still negotiate her way out of a room that had already closed around her. "We were simply trying to streamline the family's financial planning. There's no crime in wanting things structured efficiently." Michael didn't raise his voice. He rarely needed to. "Mrs. Baker," he said, using my name deliberately, letting it settle in the room as a correction to whatever version of ownership Diane still imagined for herself. "Efficient financial planning doesn't require concealing intent from the person whose signature you need. Nor does it require characterizing that person's trust as something to, in your son's words, use correctly. I have that on recording as well. Should you like me to play it again?" Diane's mouth pressed into a thin line. She said nothing further. The court officer stepped forward with quiet procedural calm and confirmed what Michael had already explained, that the property remained solely mine, that any financial authority Jonathan may have believed he was gaining through the refinance paperwork had been formally revoked and blocked before it could ever take effect, and that further legal action, should I choose to pursue it, remained entirely available to me. Jonathan's face throughout all of this moved through something like grief, though I found I couldn't fully trust that either, not anymore. Perhaps it was simply the grief of losing what he'd planned. I didn't know, and for the first time in 12 years, I realized I didn't need to know. It wasn't my responsibility to understand him anymore. They left within the hour. Jonathan packed 2 suitcases in near silence, moving through the bedroom we'd shared for barely 2 weeks, with the stiff, careful motions of a man trying to preserve some final shred of composure. Diane waited by the front door, Clear's throat arms crossed, refusing to look at me. Though just before she stepped outside, she turned and said in a voice stripped of all its earlier warmth, "You'll regret this. Family is family, Catherine. You'll learn that the hard way, alone in this house." "I already have a family," I said. "The one my father built for me. And this house is part of what he left me, not something I'm willing to hand over to protect people who were never protecting me back." She didn't respond. The door closed behind them both, and the sound of its quiet, final, ordinary was somehow louder than anything that had happened all evening. I stood alone in the front hallway for a long time after they'd gone, listening to the house settle around me, the way it had on that first, strange night with Thomas Reed's USB drive sitting heavy in my coat pocket. I walked slowly through each room the way you might walk through a house you were seeing for the first time, though nothing about it had physically changed. The same hardwood floors my father would have run his hand along, admiring the craftsmanship. The same kitchen window that caught the morning light exactly the way I'd imagined when I first saw the listing photos. Beale. The same living room where a small hidden camera behind a bookshelf had quietly, faithfully told the truth when no one else would. It didn't feel like the house had changed. It felt like I finally understood what had been true about it all along, that it was mine fully and completely in a way it had never quite felt before that phone call, before that video, before I learned exactly what I was capable of when everything I loved was threatened. I called Thomas Reed the next morning mostly to thank him again, though I think what I really wanted was simply to hear a kind voice after everything. He was quiet for a moment when I told him how it had ended, and then he said something I've carried with me since. "Houses hold on to the truth longer than people do, Mrs. Baker. I'm just glad this one still had a little truth left to give you." I think about that often now. In the month since how close I came to signing away everything my father worked his whole life to give me, simply because I trusted the wrong smile at the wrong table. I think about how love, real love, doesn't need to be protected through secrecy, through paperwork slipped quietly past someone who trusts you too much to read the fine print. I think about how the truest kind of partnership is built in the open, not behind a mother-in-law's carefully arranged furniture catalogs or a husband's practiced reassurances. I still live in that house. I've since put in the tomato garden I always planned, and some mornings I sit on the porch with my coffee and watch the light move across the yard, and I think about how easily I could have lost all of it. Not just the walls and the windows, but the quiet, hard-won peace of finally trusting my own eyes over anyone else's words. If you were in my position, I wonder what you would have done differently or the same. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you, so please subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Let's keep walking this road together.